Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Friday, April 4th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined by RCP White House correspondent Phil Wegmann and Emily Jashinsky. She's Washington correspondent for UnHerd and hosts the YouTube series Undercurrents. So, guys, the world is going a bit crazy due to Trump's tariffs. But that's not what I want to start with today. I want to talk about books, specifically the spate of books that are heading our way that deal with the Biden administration. Here's how Byron York put it today, and this is on the front page of RCP. He said, quote, "There was never a real reckoning with Biden's condition and all the false statements his representatives and defenders and supporters had made. Now that reckoning might be starting." So, Emily, here are titles of 3 books. I'm sure there'll be more, but these are the first ones out of the gate. There's Fight, Inside the Wildest Battle for the White House. It's by Jonathan Allen and Amy Parnas. Uncharted, How Trump Beat Biden, Harris, and the Odds in the Wildest Campaign in History. And Original Sin, President Biden's Decline, Its Cover-Up, and His Disastrous Choice to Run Again. That's by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson. So what do you make of these books? Are the long knives coming out, and will it have any effect on the body politic?
You know, I hope for Democrats what this isn't is an excuse to wave away their failures to connect with voters, because that won't serve the party. It won't create a healthy second major party. They're out of power in the presidency right now, and they obviously want it back. So as they're seeking to return to power, they need to do some real soul searching. And if the soul searching is just, Biden was old, we should have said something. Kamala Harris wasn't the best candidate, we should have said something. That's not going to get them exactly where they need to be. And Jake Tapper is a great example. He's a guy, he's on that book with Alex Thompson. Alex Thompson did fantastic reporting throughout the Biden administration, and sort of got close to this very important story. But Jake Tapper did not. Jake Tapper was actually one of the people who covered it very poorly, if at all. And it's just amazing to look back and realize we had this glaring crisis staring at us. I was going to say every other day, but Biden didn't get out in front of the press and the cameras every day. So maybe every other week we'd get a glimpse of him glassy-eyed staring into the distance. And, we're a year later learning things that could have been reported contemporaneously.
Phil, what do you make of it? And any juicy tidbits jump out at you from what you've read, at least from the excerpt so far?
Thus far, I think the most significant thing is Ron Klain admitting that the president wasn't all there during his tenure as chief of staff. My question for these books is, how long are they going to last on a bookshelf? And I think Emily raises a really good question here. Is the lesson from the Biden administration going to be, don't let an octogenarian have your party's nomination? Or are they going to do more soul searching? And is it going to be a question not just of personality and the physical condition of this president, but perhaps that some of these policies that they were pursuing weren't popular with the American public? Time and time again, we heard plenty from this administration that Joe Biden was as sharp as ever. I think Karine Jean-Pierre told me that at one point. But beyond that, they seemed to think that they had a messaging problem, that it wasn't that the policies like the Inflation Reduction Act and all of the spending were unpopular with the American people. It was that the experts hadn't explained it to them enough. And so I think both of those things kind of go hand in hand. One, it doesn't matter how much of an expert you are if you're lying to the American public about very basic things like the cognitive condition of the president. But 2, I think that as they need to evaluate that duplicity, they also need to wonder, were the policies that they were pushing, were those the problem as well? And I don't know if any of these books are going to answer that. I don't know if they're going to, be worth picking up off the bookshelf, 6 months to a year from now.
Yeah, you're right. And you're talking about Ron Klain. This was the quote from one of the books. I can't keep them all straight. But he's talking about Biden. He said at one point Biden had an idea. Quote, "If he looked perplexed when Trump talked, voters would understand that Trump was an idiot." Klain replied, "Sir, when you look perplexed, people just think you're perplexed. And that's the problem we have in this race." Kind of an insight into sort of the debate prep, at least. It does sound, that part of what I've read so far, I found pretty shocking, I guess. I mean, I follow this somewhat closely, maybe not as closely as you guys, but I remember being shocked that night at Biden's condition during the debate, and now I'm sort of getting an insight into how that happened. There's also, this is from the book Fight, talking about James Clyburn, who on debate night said, if it doesn't go well, he thought, I guess this is the authors, if it doesn't go well, he thought, I don't want anyone to see me cry. He sequestered at his Washington condo, mixing Diet Pepsi into a glass of Jack Daniels before he settled in. Maybe that would settle his nerves. It didn't. I mean, fun writing, right? Right, Emily? You're a cultural critic. What do you think?
Well, Clyburn was instrumental in getting Biden elected in 2020. He was credited with a lot of people in Biden circles for swinging the race in his direction, when actually many voters were genuinely, deeply concerned about Biden's age then. And so you see in the admissions in these books, which are obviously peppered throughout the books for the sake of profit and attention and reputation rehabilitation, you see all of these little instances where institutional Washington coalesced and nothing ever really broke through from the entire Democratic Party. And arguably also the media apparatus was pretty protective of the president because the White House demanded total fealty, and the White House did not want people reporting, obviously, even a whisper of this. And the press and many people in Democratic circles, you didn't have a lot of mainstream Democrats coming up and saying, yes, I'm deeply concerned about the president's age, because the Biden administration was very sensitive about it and everyone just went along to get along. And I don't know that anyone sees that as fundamentally changing. Obviously, Biden's not in that position anymore, but someone else could be someday. And there are other problems that compliant press should point out, but it's frightening.
Yeah. Well, Bill, Phil, got about a minute left here in this segment, but what about the press? I mean, we've talked a lot about the party, but the press doesn't come out very well on these books, do you think?
It's a damning indictment that these books are coming out after the fact, that this was not contemporaneous reporting. And if you were a up and rising feature writer and you decided to write a story about, I don't know, the day in the life of Joe Biden, and sort of took all of these morsels that were spoon-fed to you about how the president goes about being the executive of the United States, and you didn't push back at all, I would, maybe perhaps consider another career. There were a lot of reporters who were happy to take the White House line rather than push back. And just a final thought here, the idea of Joe Biden being president until 2028, in light of everything that we've learned, is just really incredibly startling. And these aides who were duplicitous, on the one hand, they might have thought that they were protecting the president from the public and from the press. But I think what this does show is that they did not respect him enough to think that he actually needed all of his faculties to do this job. The implication is that they just wanted him there in that office to prevent Donald Trump, or to be a figurehead so that they could have done what they wanted in his name. It's pretty gross in retrospect.
All right. Well, we're going to leave it there for this segment. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Phil and Emily. Don't go away. We'll be back in a minute, and we're going to talk about what's happening in the U.S. Senate. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm here with Phil and Emily, and I want to talk about the Senate. Lindsey Graham released the Senate budget resolution text. Happened on Wednesday. Seems like 100 years ago. The debate started today in the Senate Friday. They call it Vote-A-Rama because of how many amendments are offered during the process. Trump has so much writing on this because he's got this three-legged approach to economic policy. It's really tariffs, which he's acted on this week, budget cuts, which he's working on through DOGE, and tax cuts. So, Phil, what's going on, and are the Republicans holding together as a group on this budget battle?
I expect a very, very messy church fight among Republicans as they try and, one, set the top line here, but two, really protect their own interests. So you can't underestimate the parochial nature of these things, as every member of Congress tries to protect, a specific benefit For instance, I think we're going to see a lot of fights over, the SALT carve out, that sort of thing. But generally, right, as Congress is moving at its normal glacial pace, I think that what we saw from the White House really should contribute to a sense of urgency. Trump went ahead and did tariffs on his own. The market is reacting. These Republicans are going to be looking at an attempt to, get the budget and get budget reconciliation, the vehicle for these tax cuts, with much more urgency, because they're going to try and soften that blow.
Emily, what do you make of what's going on the Hill right now?
Yeah, that's a good point. Senator Josh Hawley went to the White House yesterday and posted on X afterwards that he talked to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump assured him there will be no cuts to Medicaid and Social Security. And this is going to be quite an interesting balance for everyone here, because we saw Bill Cassidy on Newsmax this week talk about, quote, cutting Medicaid, and then correcting himself to say reforming Medicaid. And this is now a Republican Party that is much more conscious of the working class base. And so these tax cuts are on pace to be something like we saw in 2017, which I would argue was beneficial to the middle class, even if it was also beneficial to the upper class. These things don't cancel each other out, but it's a new day for the GOP, and tariffs are going to put market fluctuation after the tariffs and potentially rising prices are going to put pressure on Republicans to come up with something that eases the blow or softens the blow, as Philip just said.
Yeah. Well, Ted Cruz was on Larry Kudlow last night, Thursday night, and tried to put a little bit of space between himself and the president. He sort of said that tariffs, he was not a fan of tariffs. I think that's as far as he would go. But, Phil, he can't be the only one in the Senate who's looking at this going, they've got some of them are up in 2 years. Trump's got 4 years, right? So, I mean, their timeline is a little different than his.
And Donald Trump is done, right? Despite these machinations about a third term.
Maybe. We'll see.
You saw Senator Kennedy from Louisiana say that tariffs were like whiskey. A little bit here and there can be helpful, but if you go too far too quickly, you can have a really bad night. I think a lot of these senators were just as surprised as all of Wall Street, because they learned about the specific tariff rates as Donald Trump revealed them in the Rose Garden. What we're finding now is that Donald Trump didn't go looking for input from members of Congress or from industry. He made this up on his own. And I think that you could start to see a bit of daylight between these members of Congress, some of whom are up for reelection, in 2026, and Donald Trump, because, he has arrived at the fact that this is his legacy. He's done after this. And it doesn't help when you have the president of the United States retweeting videos on his True Social platform saying that he wants to tank the market by 20% in a single month so that he can do sort of 4D chess, where he forces the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. They can weaken the dollar and somehow put the United States back on a better footing. I mean, the markets like certainty, and incumbents like booming markets when they're going into a reelection campaign. So yeah, we're starting to see some fissures open up because Donald Trump win it alone. And some of these guys, they're going to be on all on their own when they stand for reelection.
Yeah, and Emily, we got about a minute left, but how about the Democrats in all this? Because Chuck Schumer said today, Democrats will expose the dark corners of the Republican plan. We will lay the case for how Republicans will plan to destroy Medicaid as we know it. They're really hitting the Medicaid story pretty hard, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. And in any bill that's going to be as sizable as this one, there will be dark corners. That's how Washington works. That's how lobbyists pay their bills. So I think it's probably going to be a political gift to Democrats, even if it does have sort of some positive effects on the middle class. Democrats have a really easy, I think, argument to make in the public when you're when you have Elon Musk and multimillionaires like Scott Bessent, billionaires like Howard Lutnick running around talking about how everything's fine. You just have to trust Trump. That's what Howard Lutnick said on CNN over and over again this week. Just trust Trump, getting into like basically North Korean territory. I shouldn't say basically, if you squint, using North Korean territory there. So it's a political gift, I think, to Democrats. They have a lot to work with on this.
Well, we're going to keep an eye on it. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I've been talking with Phil Wegmann and Emily Jashinsky. It's been great having them on. Don't go away. When we come back, I'm going to talk to Chris Christie, former governor of New Jersey, about just about this, about Medicaid and especially about opioids, which is a issue he cares deeply about. Don't go away. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and my next guest is Chris Christie. He was governor of New Jersey from 2010 to 2018, and he chaired the President's Commission on Combating Drug Addiction and the Opioid Crisis back in 2017. So, Governor, welcome to the program.
Andrew, happy to be here.
So you have a piece in Real Clear Politics. I commend it to people. It's really a heartfelt plea to protect Medicaid coverage for opioid and substance abuse disorders. Why is that so important, and why is it important to you?
Well, two things. First, on why it's important to me. When I was governor, I spent a lot of time working on the opioid crisis and drug addiction in general. It's a disease. It's a disease like cancer or heart disease or diabetes. It can be treated, and its ramifications for not being treated ruin not only the life of the person who suffers from the addiction, but also countless lives around them that are impacted by it. And so I think it's a crisis not only of loss of life in this country over the course of the last decade, but also it's a ruination of lives, and we need to do what we can to stop that. Secondly, it should be without regard to whether someone has financial means or not to get this type of treatment. In the end, these folks wind up in the system one way or another. Sometimes in the correctional system, sometimes in other parts of the legal system, where it's costing our government and our citizens a lot of money to have people remain addicted. And I think Medicaid treatment has shown the way to be very effective if you give people access to the care, they have a much better chance of getting into recovery and hopefully staying in recovery.
So there's about 5 million Americans, I believe, roughly, that are in Medicaid being treated for this kind of addiction. And I guess your concern, and this is all in the article, is that in February, Congress passed this resolution, could result in like a 10% cut in Medicaid spending, possibly over the next 10 years. We have this huge federal deficit. Obviously, people are looking for cuts. But one of the things they're doing is talking about having requirements for people who are on Medicaid, work requirements, other requirements. Will that sort of thing disproportionately affect people who suffer from opioid addiction? Is that your concern, or what is your concern about Medicaid in particular?
Well, because these are our most disadvantaged folks who are on Medicaid. These are the folks who often are having trouble getting employment. These are folks who are often having trouble finding doctors and other healthcare providers who will provide that care to them. And so those folks are most in need of this treatment because there are no alternatives for them. Where with others who have conventional health insurance, even Medicare, for those who are the elderly and become addicted to opioids as well, they have some options. The optionality in Medicaid is much narrower, and if we cut back, how people on this in this particular area of substance use disorder get treated, the ramifications are going to be death and real harm to the families around those folks and friends around those folks who are addicted. And so, those who are least fortunate, it always seems to me, are the ones that we should be focused on. Now, look, Andrew, I don't have any trouble with work requirements. Someone's able-bodied and in recovery to continue to have their Medicaid coverage, work requirements should be considered for that. I don't have a problem with that. But we have to be able to distinguish between those who are actually in recovery and those that are still in the throes of addiction. Because if you're still in the throes of addiction trying to get to recovery, working is often your full-time job is getting to recovery.
Right.
During that period of time, we need to give them, I would hope, the room to be able to get to recovery. So then they become contributing members to our society, again, both as workers and as mothers and fathers and sons and daughters.
Yeah. And, you know, we think of Medicaid, or I think of Medicaid often as being mostly for elderly people. But the truth is that these young people who are on Medicaid disproportionately are suffering from addiction. It's a large number, right? That's part of the problem.
True. It's absolutely true. And you have them coming predominantly from families who don't have private health insurance themselves. And, you know, the ability for these folks to be able to access the care they need to find their way out of this darkness is just, to me, so incredibly morally important. And I know from having spoken to President Trump about this when he was president between 2017 and 2021, that he has a real appreciation for the addiction issue. He's had addiction in his own family.
Mm-hmm.
His own brother died in large measure due to an addiction to alcohol. And so this is not something that's foreign to him. So I hope that when people are, you know, presenting these different options to him, that he keeps in mind what a difference this treatment makes. He was incredibly supportive of all of the provisions of the report of our commission back in 2017, and all the ones that could be put in place from an executive perspective, he did. So I'm hoping that the president will do the same thing again. And
what can Congress do? Because a lot of your article points to Congress as being able to do something about this. Is there something specific that you believe Congress should be doing?
Well, certainly in the near term, Andrew, when they're going through this cutting, to do it with a scalpel and not a chainsaw. You know, that to understand that there is no doubt that there is fraud, waste, and abuse in the Medicaid program. Even the biggest supporters of the Medicaid program will admit that. The question is, where are the places where we can get those savings from, and to do so very carefully and with a consideration of facts, not just of rhetoric. And I think that's the biggest thing Congress can do. They're the appropriators. They're the one under our Constitution who gets to decide, you know, where this money gets spent.
Sometimes, so, yes.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how those fights continue. But, you know, certainly my reading of the Constitution are the ones who are doing it. And I hope that what they do is take this part of it very seriously, because we've made some progress in the opioid crisis, but we're nowhere near where we need to be yet. And we certainly don't want to backslide. And getting people off of Medicaid treatment. Look, a lot of the people who get addicted to opioids, Andrew, you know, wind up going on, you know, medical therapy. They get medicine that helps them to defeat the cravings for opioids. That coverage is Medicaid coverage. And if they lose the ability to take this medication, it is overwhelmingly likely that they'll slide back to addiction. And that can lead to death and a lot of other really bad ramifications for the people around them.
Yeah. Well, you're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm talking with Christie. And Governor, I wanted to ask you about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., because last month he renewed the public health emergency on the national opioid crisis. It was set to expire, and he renewed it, I guess, for 90 days. And this is what he said at the time. He said, this administration is going to treat this urgent crisis in American health as the national security emergency it is. And he went on to say, renewing the emergency declaration affirms the administration's commitment to addressing the opioid overdose crisis. Do you view him as an ally in this fight?
I really hope he is. I think he should be. He's a man in recovery himself, and he understands you know, how difficult this is and how life-changing it has been for him. And I've heard him speak about this, to be in recovery. And any number of members of his family as well, like his cousin Patrick Kennedy, former member of Congress, was on the opioid commission with me. And I know that generation of Kennedys, many of them understand in a personal way how important this is. So I'm very hopeful that Secretary Kennedy will continue to keep a focus on this. He's got a big department to run, but having the personal experience he has had, both himself and inside his own, you know, family, I think we could have an ally in Secretary Kennedy, and I hope we do.
Yeah. Well, I want to end at least this part on some rare good news. I mean, it is true that opioid addiction is on decline. It's in some states it's down by as much as 30%. But as we said before, 65% of the Medicaid patients under the age of 26 are there for treatment of substance abuse of some sort. So we're making progress, but it's still a huge issue. I want to go back to the young people for a second again there. How about in your state, in New Jersey? Was that a particular problem that you dealt with as a governor as well?
It absolutely was. And we reached out in many different ways through colleges and universities, through high schools. We put addiction counselors in every hospital in New Jersey, so that if someone came in and was reversed from an overdose, that the first person they would see after their medical situation was stabilized was an addiction counselor. All those things, I think, helped to roll back some of the numbers in New Jersey. But when you see those numbers, remember, I left the governorship in 2018. Those numbers, yanked back up during COVID because of the isolation of COVID, and a lot of people fell backwards. So it tells us we had started to make progress in 2015, 16, and 17. And then we fell backwards in 2020 and 2021. Now we're making progress again. So what it tells you is this can easily go the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And so what we really need to do is to stay focused on it, to keep this progress. We're saving families. We're saving families in this country by doing this. And I think it's something that most American taxpayers would say is worth the money they send to the government to try to save the lives of their friends, their neighbors, their loved ones from being able to deal with this disease in a way that puts them into recovery and makes them, once again, contributing members to our society.
Right. Well, Governor, we've got just about a minute left here, and I do have to ask you the political question. It's Trump administration. It's been a little over 2 months. What grade do you give them so far, and what do you think of the job they've done so far?
Incomplete so far.
There's a political answer.
I think it's too early to give them any kind of solid grade. But what I will say to you is, look, I think I break down some of the issues on immigration. I think they've done a very good job at the border in stopping the inflow of folks coming into the country illegally. I think that they're working hard at removing the criminal element from our country on immigration. I hope they don't go too far and stray too far from that. Let's deal with the criminals first. So I think they've done an excellent job on immigration. I'm concerned about these tariffs and what it's going to do to our economy, both long-term and short-term. And I hope that the president reconsiders what he's doing there. So my grade would be much less generous in the economic area at this point than it is in the immigration area. And look, stylistically, Donald Trump, as everybody knows, I've known him for 23 years. We've been close at times. We're not close at the moment. But, I got to give him credit where he has done good things on immigration, but question a 40-year cause of his that he executed yesterday on tariffs. It is the one thing, if you look at Donald Trump politically, that he has remained consistent on. He loved tariffs in the 80s, the 90s, the aughts, the teens, and now the 20s. And he's finally getting his opportunity to test his theory. I'm very skeptical of his theory.
All right. Well, we're going to leave it there. I've been talking to Chris Christie, Governor. It's great to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
Andrew, thanks for having me, and thanks for the coverage of the opioid crisis. It's really important.
You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. We'll be right back after this.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics. You're listening to RCP on Sirius XM Radio. I have the privilege now and honor of talking to John McWhorter, who teaches, I say he's the nation's foremost expert on linguistics. And so there you go. And he teaches at Columbia. He kind of reconstituted the department in linguistics at Columbia. It had fallen into disuse. And he writes for you've seen him in the New Yorker and the New York Times. He writes a column for the Washington Post. And he's been around.
New York Times.
New York Times.
Yeah.
Did I say New York Post?
Column for the New York Times.
New York.
Yeah.
The other day, John, I said Washington Times and I meant Washington Post. So I'm glad you corrected
Very
me.
easy to, yeah.
They're very different newspapers. You taught at Cal for a while, didn't you?
I was at Berkeley from 95 to '02. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And that's where I think that's when I first became aware of your work. Anyway, you authored many books. And the one we're going to talk about today is a new book, Pronoun Trouble. And it's a short book. I urge you to read it and buy it. It's coming out soon. It may be a small book, but it's very rich. Every page has stuff in it that stopped, made me think, made me laugh, made me make notes to myself. One of the things I notice, and you've talked about this before, John, people think that languages always simplify. There was that great Star Trek episode where people were just speaking, monosyllabic language, and they thought it turned out to be English, And so, what's the sitch? What's an app? AI. We have all these things, but you point out that language complexify even as they're simplifying. And that's what makes the study of linguistics so rich. All right, let's get to the pronouns. The first pronoun, I learned a lot in this book. The first pronoun we'll talk about, of course, is the first pronoun, I, the first person singular. Turned out it used to be something like in, I don't know, original Indo-European language, Proto-Indo-European scholars call it egg, like EG,
exactly,
right? Like ego, But I was thinking the closest I studied German in college was ich or ish, German. They kind of kept to it, but I and all these other languages, and you
all come from the same thing, yeah.
But you also talk about what a problematic concept the first person pronoun is for young people, and you even have an example that my own children have used with me. Hold you, Daddy, hold you. And they mean hold me,
right?
But they heard hold you. Do you want me to hold you?
So they think their name is you, right?
Right.
Exactly.
But also that a pronoun differentiates us from other people. To talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, pronouns are the way that we talk about ourselves and refer to other people, and especially the way we avoid having to say the full name of something over and over again. And so they stand in for nouns. They're pronouns. And it can seem kind of mundane that, well, there's I and there's you. But the truth is that mastering that idea that we are referring to ourselves and then we're referring to that which to us is another person, babies don't pick up on that immediately. And so that's why your 1.5-year-old will reach up and say, carry you, because as far as she knows, that's what my daughter used to say, you is her, because you point to her and you say you. And so she thinks of it as a name at first. And then they finally realize that it's a matter of different minds interacting. But that's a trick. That's a human trick. And so pronouns are interesting in that way, just first of all.
Does it suggest that human beings are born as collectivists or socialists, that we all think of ourselves as one, or does it mean something different?
It means that we, of all of the animals, have the most developed what's called theory of mind, that it's fundamental to humanity to be always imagining how things look to the other person, and to be able to do that spontaneously and continuously without thinking about it. We're always in the other person's head. A lot of the way we talk is based on trying to always track whether we're getting things across and what the other person might be thinking. That's not something that even simians are as good at as we are. It's a lot of why we are what we are.
We're going to build up. I'm not pretending that this is just an academic conversation about pronouns, because pronouns are in the news these days. They've become political, and we'll get to that. But I want to just try and give you listeners on Sirius, if you're watching on our podcast, just a sense of how rich this little book is, because I can't tell you much how I liked it. But partly, John, I felt chastised. I've done copy editing. I edit copy all the time. I'm always getting my reporters to try and get to agree, their tenses to agree, and the plural verbs that the plural nouns they use, and then the pronouns that are singular, they don't match. But you talk about in your book English. This is a quote: English, the fakest rule in English language, and it's of course John McWhorter and I are having a conversation. That's grammatical, but it's not intuitive. And it's not, and it's not necessary.
That's not the way any child would spontaneously put it. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So where did we get this difference from me and I and objects? Who laid that on us?
Yeah, it really is laid on us, and it's so hard to feel it that way because we're taught I as subject, me as object. That feels tidy. It's actually kind of easier than what the real rule is in English as we actually speak it. And that's just based on the fact that that's the way ego and me, that's I and me in Latin, work. That rule is something that people came up with who were under this romantic idea that Latin was the quintessence of human languages. And it was for parochial reasons that we now call classics, not to knock classics at all, but they didn't know much about the rest of the languages of the world. They only knew so much about the history of the world. So to them, there was this magic of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So Latin is magic, and therefore, if English is going to take its place as a world language, as it was in the 1600s and then 1700s, they thought English needs to be analyzed the way Latin is. So that meant that although people were already ordinarily saying, John and me had an interview, the idea was, no, you're supposed to say John and I had an interview, which some people said too, but the idea was that John and I was the correct form, John and me was wrong. But the only reason that they said John and me was wrong was because of Latin, whereas over across the channel in France, John and me had an interview is the only way to say it. You can't say John et je had an interview. It would sound ridiculous. In Spanish, you would. In French, you wouldn't. So languages differ in how their pronouns really work. Ours happen to work like French's, but to this day, we're operating under this idea that to grow out of childhood is to learn how English on that is more like Latin than English ever actually has been.
Well, and then we're left with things like, I poked him while he slept. All right, that's grammatical. You use that example, but you could never say, I poked he while him slept. But
Right.
really, the two pronouns should be interchangeable and are in some languages.
Yeah, there are languages where you would say, I poked him and him slept. That would be the way you said it. And I get across in the book why in the language you would say him slept in that way. And we're not speaking it. That language happens to be Kurdish, which is related to Persian. But it's just to show that perfectly natural, normal, conscious human beings can use language in that way. And nobody would question it. And therefore, we have to understand that pronouns differ from language to language. And the way it works in English really is just that this is oversimplifying it a bit. I is what you use when it's right up next to the verb. So I go, I sleep, I work. If it's not right up next to the verb by itself, but it's joined with something like Michael, and once that happens, it changes to me. So it's me both as an object. It's me if you do it all alone. Who went with you? Me. And it's me if there's a Michael and before it. The only time you use I is if it happens to be all alone and right before the verb. In other words, French. This is not just something made up for English. But we don't get taught that. We get taught instead Latin.
Well, your book shows, the book is Pronoun Trouble. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, RealClearPolitics, talking to John McWhorter, brilliant linguist and good conversationalist too, as you can tell. John, you also talk about what do we call it? Second person
Singular
pronoun.
and
Yeah, yeah. And plural. You. And of course, everybody knows this and they wonder about it. People have written about it. There's you it's a word in English. There's very few of them. It's like deer. It's DEER. It's plural or singular, either one, except that we have trouble with that because you're in a room of people and you say, you're fired or you get a raise. Is it the whole room or is it one person? Well, so we need to know. So people from time immemorial have used these other constructs. I thought use was something that they used in the Bronx until I read your book. It's actually older than y'all. And you guys, and you all, Yins was a new one I'd heard. You say that's from Pittsburgh?
Pittsburghers pride themselves, as they should, on yins. That's right. Ewans becomes yins. Yeah.
And Ewans is something you hear in the Piedmont, I guess, in the Carolina South. Dated, but you still hear it occasionally. And
Exactly.
But you talk about you guys, and this is one it's a little fraught because it gets into politics. You guys, meaning you people, but used by women to groups of men and women, or just even groups of women, and used less frequently, but also by guys, but normally about guys, but not always. So how did this catch on, and should we get rid of it?
Well, no, we shouldn't get rid of it because really what's happened is that women have taken on you guys as a way of referring to one another in the plural. And what they're saying is not you dudes. They're not saying that. They're saying you people. And the problem is that when they say guy, it sounds like this other word guy we have that refers to men. There are now two words that are pronounced guy. One of them means somebody who shaves. One of them means just all. And so women have taken it on, and you can see it as actually evidence that, the sense of equality between the sexes, we're nowhere near perfect on it, but that it's increasing. But there are some women who hear it from the outside as if it's effacing femininity. But the problem is, if it was you gals, gals is slightly archaic and slightly denigrating. You women is a little too clinical. You need something casual. And so women have grabbed onto what was in the air. And not only are they calling each other dude as an interjection, dude, look at that guy over there. But also, right, but you guys. And so there's this controversy. And so I try to get across that words evolve into new ones. And so in that case, guy is a different word, even if you can strain and think it sounds like they're saying, hey, you men. But we all know that's not what the women mean. So I just try a discussion about that, despite the fact that I am a man, and it may sound a little, kind of bombastic for me to be pronouncing on it, but I can't help being a man. And so I just tried to put in my 2 cents.
Well, you also, it was counterintuitive because it came into vogue as we were getting rid of words like stewardess and fireman, replacing them with flight attendant and firefighter. So again, your point is language is sometimes moving in 2 different directions at the same time, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
All right, I guess. All right. Well, this brings us to they and them and the whole non-binary consciousness raising that's been going on. And I've got to tell you, I read that part of the book twice, and
thank you.
And I'm not quite satisfied that we figured it out, because there's a movement now that's caught on, and I want people to buy the book, so I'm not giving away all the. My friend Chip Scanlon used to say when he was a writing coach at Point Institute, you leave gold coins for the reader along the way. So I'm not going to hand the reader all your gold coins, John.
Okay.
But we're not going to go back to that. You're not going to force people who are non-binary to say woman or men. You're not going to force them to say their name each and every time. So this is caught on and it's here to stay. But it's still confusing. We still need a word that means the plural of people, whatever their gender. So what do we do?
Yeah. And it has to be they, because the natural impulse is to think we need to make up a pronoun. And people have tried to do that among the kids. There's some people who use Z. There was a heesh, like he and she, that was
That's
tried
right.
a while ago. But those don't catch on because pronouns aren't like other words. You can't make one up. You can make up a word like fax. You can make up a word like cryptocurrency that shortens into crypto. All of that works. But with pronouns, you're talking about the nails and screws of the language. If you make up a new one, we have to use those words too much and too spontaneously for the new ones to feel plausible. And so we have to use what we've got. And in English, that's a tough one because we really don't have enough pronouns. We're a very pronoun poor language if we compare our pronouns to how pronouns work in the other 6,999. So all we've got is I, you, he, she, it, we, and they. So if we're going to have a gender neutral pronoun, it has to be they, partly because we have been using it gender neutrally in a different way, really since Chaucer. So tell each student that they can hand in their paper at the 3rd door down the hall. And that
those tenses didn't match, but we do it, right?
Is right. Gender neutral. And we've done that spontaneously for a long time. So what are we going to use when it's somebody says my boyfriend is at the airport and they want to get a haircut there? Well, if it's going to be that specific, well, what's it going to be? It's not going to be Z wants to get a haircut there. It's not going to be he wants to get a haircut there. That will never work. And so we're stuck with they. So we have a challenge in getting used to this new usage, I think.
Well, I don't mind it in that use. The problem, it's going to take some getting used to. I'm a little older than you, but people our age are going to. But there's also some times where there's going to be some ambiguity. You're not going to exactly know. You cited an example in a New Yorker piece. It's going to be a little bit confusing. But maybe that's just the price we pay to, avoid offending people and typecasting people.
I wrote about this recently. I wrote that when it comes to writing, I think we should use capital T with they when we mean one specific person, because that way, even though sometimes the problem isn't that they is at the beginning of the sentence, but just as often it isn't, you would know what they is meant, as opposed to our current situation where it can be confusing in print. In speech, in my experience, context often takes care of a lot of it. But then again, there are also cases where you're wondering which they people are referring to. So yeah, there are challenges here, but I'm not sure we can think that this they is going to go away. I think it's here. And so yeah, even especially those of us, I may not be as old as you, but I'm pushing 60. It can be hard, but I'm not sure there's any other choice. So here we are.
We got about 1 minute left, John. I wanted to ask you one last question and then make an observation as I sign out. The question is, did you become interested? You went to Quaker school when you were a young man, and they were still using thou at that time. Did this pique an interest in pronouns for you that's been latent all this time?
No, actually, because my interest in language was always in foreign ones. It was fascinating to me to hear living people, under 50 saying thee, which is what they were saying. But at the time, I thought that's just English, and it just sounded strange. But I look back on it, and I think I witnessed actual, living people using it spontaneously.
Well, thank you. You've been listening to John McWhorter, linguist, teacher, author. His new book is Pronoun Trouble. I urge you to get it. When you read it, you'll know whether or not, I'm not going to give it away, ye old shop is correct English or not, and why. You might even learn why, or maybe not, why Donald Trump said that, quoted Robert E. Lee inaccurately, I'm sure, as saying, never fight uphill, me boys.
Me boys.
Anyway, thank you, John. I really appreciate it.
Carl, thank you so much.
All right. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, and that'll do it for this week. Have a great weekend.